So this is a quick follow-up to my last video on the Wii U gamepad clone, and this always seems to happen when you're a YouTuber who does projects. You'll have some problem you've been wrestling with for months, if not years. You'll feel like you've explored every single option, researched everything there is to know about it. You put it out on Patreon and no one has any ideas, and then the moment you publish it on YouTube, someone's like, oh, did you try this? And it's the solution to every single problem you had. That's what happened to me with the Raspberry Pi. Yes, pretty much immediately people started troubleshooting why the Raspberry Pi seemed to have a mandatory 3 frames of latency and making suggestions for what I could do about it. One of the most common was, couldn't we add 3 blank frames in the beginning to offset it? I think what people thought would happen was by adding blank frames, the sending side would line up with the receiving side. But a frame is a frame, even if it's blank. By adding them to the queue, we're just delaying the output even further. A 3-frame delay becomes a 6-frame delay. But a more interesting suggestion was, what if we tripled the frames going in and just skipped the extra 2 coming out, essentially forcing it to flush out the real frame we just sent? In theory, this seemed plausible, but I did have some concerns. First, as far as the decoder was concerned, we'd effectively be turning a 60 FPS stream into a 180 FPS stream. And not a single resource suggested that the Pi Zero would be even remotely capable of decoding 180 frames per second. Secondly, just tripling the frames wouldn't work. As we established in the main video, most H.264 frames only store the differences, or more specifically the motion between this frame and the last. For example, make these pixels here move over here. It takes advantage of the fact that most video is capturing some kind of smooth motion. Therefore, the only way to keep the video stream faithful is to decode each frame in order. If you don't, then the motion data starts getting applied to the wrong parts of the frame, leading to a corruption of the original picture. This is what we saw when we tried to decode on the Pi Zero 2's CPU and it couldn't quite keep up with all of the incoming frames. Duplicating frames would produce the same kind of problem. We'd end up applying motion to parts of the frame that aren't supposed to move like that. That being said, we could fabricate a do-nothing frame and insert 2 of those for every real frame. There was still no guarantee that the Pi could keep up with this, but in theory, if it could, that would keep the video stream faithful and work around the 3 frames of latency. I was pessimistic about our chances, but I figured I'd give it a try anyway. Why leave any stone unturned? But what actually happened was not what I expected. I tested it out expecting to see at least some kind of difference, but I didn't. The feed was the same as before, including the exact same amount of latency. But how is that possible? If we're inserting a bunch of frames, where did they all go? Well, I confirmed from the logs that it was indeed sending those null frames and skipping them correctly. So astonishingly, the Pi could keep up with this preposterous frame rate, as long as 2/3 of the frames were dummy frames, but it still ended up imposing the exact same amount of delay. So the only thing that could mean was the delay is not actually a per frame delay like I thought. It's a time delay, as in real-world wall clock time. Doesn't matter if it's 3 frames at 60 FPS or 9 frames at 180 FPS, apparently they all just take a certain amount of time to work their way through the pipeline. And that just happens to be long enough to cause a couple of frames of delay at 60 FPS. To confirm, I modified my latency test tool to wait a certain amount of time between sending and receiving a frame. And indeed, if we just wait, we get the same frame we just sent without having to push any more frames into the pipeline. So yeah, it's not about flushing the frames out, it's just a matter of waiting for them to finish. It seemed like there was no way around it. I was ready to call it there and was even preparing a GitHub comment announcing to the world that it was a lost cause, when suddenly I got the following Discord message. Now, at first, I have to admit, I was a little skeptical. I had literally just proven this thing had an impenetrable time delay. What could someone else have found that I didn't? Well, earlier that day, GitHub user eintim23 had reached out offering some suggestions for reducing the 3-frame delay. And while they didn't end up making a difference, we both kept investigating the issue separately. Most of his findings lined up with mine that it was a time delay rather than a frame delay, however, he had managed to discover a breakthrough that I hadn't. It wasn't all of the frames that took that long. See, I was right that the first frame took about 50 milliseconds, which is way too long and sets us back by a little over 3 frames, but look at the next one. It only took 5 milliseconds, same as the next one and the next one. So even if the first frame does take a really long time, it would only take a few more frames before we were caught up again, as long as we allow ourselves to skip the frames that the really long frame displaced. And that was the big problem. Vanilla simply wasn't designed for a decoder like this. Vanilla was designed around FFmpeg's software decoder, which is a simple synchronous frame-in, frame-out affair. If it ever does say it isn't ready to produce a frame yet, it's almost always because it needs another input frame, like when it's dealing with those pesky bidirectional frames I mentioned in the main video. But even though I knew the Wii U's video feed didn't use these, I still wrote Vanilla's decode loop to, if the decoder wasn't ready yet, send another frame before trying again, because that's just how you usually write them. And I mean, it worked, just not for the reasons I thought. I thought it was because it needed those additional frames. In reality, it only appeared to work because the slow frame happened to be done by then, and I was unwittingly creating a backlog that never got drained. Yes, it turns out I was complicit in this 3 frames of latency. Knowing that, the fix is simple. Rather than just shrug and send another frame if the decoder hasn't produced anything yet, we keep polling it at regular intervals so we can grab the latest frame as soon as it's ready. The actual plumbing was a little more complicated. I ended up moving this polling to a new thread so it could do it at all times without interfering with the main thread, which you know how it is. But here's the important part. I am very pleased to announce that now the Raspberry Pi Zero has the same amount of latency as the original Wii U gamepad. So all of that discouragement and non-recommending I did of the Raspberry Pi Zero, feel free to disregard it. Just about any Raspberry Pi should now make for a viable Wii U gamepad. Where does that leave the Orange Pi? Well, on paper, it probably is still the superior computer, what with its slightly faster CPU and decoder, and if you can ever get one cheaper than the Raspberry Pi again, it's probably a no-brainer. However, you are much more likely to find the Raspberry Pi in stores or buried in a drawer somewhere, and if you do, in practice, it should be just as good. Thanks to Eintim23 for finding the missing piece. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye guys.